Okay, so welcome everybody to today's webinar. So this is part of the Youth Leadership webinar series that the National Empowerment TA Center is running. And specifically today, we're going to be talking about youth involvement and leadership in research. Oh, wait. Did my screen just disappear? Or can you still see it? Can everybody still see my screen? Oh, you can. Okay. So just a few kind of housekeeping notes first before we get started. Just first disclaimer and acknowledgement that the webinar was developed in part under a SAMHSA TA contract, and the views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. This webinar is already being recorded, and the PowerPoint presentation and audio recording will be posted to the National Empowerment Center as soon as they're website as soon as they're processed, and that's www.powertoyou.org. And at the end of the webinar, there will be an open, we've actually left a lot of time for a Q&A session. But you're invited to ask questions at any time using the question function. For anybody new to GoToWebinar, there's not a chat function that's usable for participants, although we, the presenters, can post things in the chat. And we'll kind of handle the questions that you ask in the order they're received at the end. We also have some of our own discussion questions that I'll be asking the panelists depending on how many questions there are on the audience. So hopefully there will be just kind of a lively discussion between and among the panelists after they finish their formal presentations, as well as between the audience and the panelists. Okay, all right, so just a few kind of framing slides to kick us off. So our panelists today will be Kristen Thorpe, Kelly Davis, Ben Ballman, Shannon Pagden, and then I'm moderating and facilitating. The theme here is really, kind of thinking about and approaching research as a tool for activism and social change. And for anybody, in the audience who doesn't know me, I'm social work faculty at the University of Pittsburgh, and for a very long time now, can certainly no longer call myself a youth researcher, for a very long time now have been really kind of championing much more robust service user, survivor, disability involvement, and ideally really leadership in research and undertaking research with more of an activist orientation. I think in the US compared to other countries, especially in sort of the mental health and disability space, we see a lot less happening here. So research not being kind of leveraged and taken up to kind of bring about social change and social justice, and being more maybe kind of ceded to professional researchers, academics. So that's one thing we kind of hope to generate more of a conversation and hopefully kind of inspire some interest among folks who may not really have kind of thought about research as another activist tool before. I really wanted just to emphasize that this is really kind of part of a global movement. So literally the kind of the origins of participatory research, participatory action research, and sort of democratized approaches to research are very, very global, and some of the major kind of intellectual founding figures based in Latin America, including Falls Borda and Freire. So we see some of these kind of older Spanish language documents here and photos illustrating participatory action research in what's sometimes called the Southern School, meaning the global South. Participatory activist research now, happens all around all around the globe in a really powerful way and across many, many different areas: sexuality, health, poverty, anti-poverty, climate change, environmental justice, etc. On the mental health side, there's a particularly kind of strong tradition of what a lot of people refer to as survivor research. So that's more activist-oriented, survivor-led mental health services, survivor-led research in the UK, and in recent years has really kind of been taken up in a more significant way in a number of other countries, certainly Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and increasingly we find this in other global regions. The US, again, there is sort of a history of this work here, but I would say sort of still very underdeveloped relative to other countries. We don't have kind of a formalized national association of user survivor researchers. There's not a lot of infrastructure, and major funders don't necessarily even prioritize user involvement in their grants. So like the National Institutes of Health, which is by far the largest health research funder in the US. And then, just kind of our goals for today. So you'll be hearing about diverse youth-driven and youth-led research projects and collaborations by our panelists, and they're very different, and hopefully just kind of introduce you to kind of the variety of forms this can take, and also, especially in the case maybe of Youth Move National, what kind of collaboration with university entities from the kind of positionality of the national organization looks like. And then we really hope that the discussion again is kind of very lively and engaged, and just we can kind of collectively think about research as a mechanism of transformative change together. And that is it. I'm going to be passing it on to Kristen next. I want to just point to the survey up on this slide is actually in the chat, and while you can't add any comments to the chat, you should be able to click on it. The survey is for anybody who is interested in getting involved or learning more about youth-driven mental health, psychosocial disability, neurodiversity related research. And there's some options and an open space just to tell us a little bit about your interests. And the goal there is that for anybody who is interested, we can then follow up with you, try to connect you with people, mentors, resources, other projects, other people who are interested in similar things. So if you have any interest at all, definitely kind of fill out the survey, and we will follow up. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to Kristen. If I can figure out how. Sharing. Oh yes, okay. Change presenter. Okay, did that work? Yes.
Yes, and can y'all see my my screen? Great. So I'm going to just do a really quick introduction of myself. I'm Kristen. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from Portland, Oregon. I am the youth program director at Youth Move National, and I'm also the project director of our Peer Center, which is actually one of the other consumer and consumer supporter TA centers like National Empowerment Center. Same disclaimer, won't read it. So in line, this is some of our team, but in line with our mission, the MOVE and Youth Move stands for Motivating Others Through Voices of Experience. So our staff are all individuals who identify as having lived experience in one or more youth serving systems, and we now use that to support our chapter network and other youth-run programs to provide leadership development to young people with lived experience and who are systems involved, as well as supporting systems change initiatives by providing TA training to state agencies, to provider agencies, you name it. Won't read that. Very quickly, some of our core principles and values include building the capacity of young people to engage in systems change work, including in research, assisting youth leadership programs, creating youth movement principles and policies, developing training tools, guides, and other documents to support youth-run programs, uniting the voices and causes of youth, and really providing that national leadership representing youth served by mental health and other youth serving systems. We are a chapter-based organization. Everywhere in red is where we have had a chapter recently. And really quickly, before I talked about some of the examples of research that Youth Move has participated in, I wanted to share, what are some of the outcomes, or what is, the justification for engaging youth in research. And one of the most important things is that young people are experts in their own experiences, and because of that, they're able to provide, unique perspectives and knowledge based on their kind of firsthand involvement with the systems that are serving them. So in the context of mental health research, they're able to really speak to best practices or things that have worked or not worked so well in their mental health care. It can really cultivate a more mindful and respectful approach to conducting research, particularly with young people who maybe are members of vulnerable populations. And it really actually produces more relevant evidence that can be used in advocacy efforts. So, you're asking the right questions if young people are involved. They're able to kind of help guide the framework of various research questions that are ultimately going to, have long-term, more relevant evidence. And then finally, it's really rooted in the preferences of individuals with lived experience. This is one framework for youth engagement that I often talk about, and there's sort of these levels, much like, Hart's ladder of youth engagement and youth participation. Young people, especially in research, are often seen as objects, right? They are young people who complete surveys or maybe, provide data, but they're really kind of passive in the research endeavor. So what we have been trying to do at Youth Move National is to support individuals or organizations or universities who are conducting research to really move from seeing young people as objects or resources that they can tap into, but really seeing them as partners throughout the process of research. Oh, there we go. So some examples of work that we have done, and these are sort of external, so academic partnerships that we have participated in. The first I wanted to highlight is PCORI, so that's the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which actually is funds research that has to do with consumer and patient engagement. And throughout that process, it was a research study on the use of antipsychotics within the child welfare system. We know that particularly youth of color or receive kind of disproportionate levels of being prescribed antipsychotic medication. So it was really exciting that they invited us to be part of this process. We sat on their stakeholder advisory board. We helped develop processes and protocols for the study. We helped to recruit young people who with lived experience in child welfare and having been prescribed antipsychotic medication. And then throughout that process, we engaged our Youth Best Practice Committee, which is a sort of Youth Move's de facto advisory council, which is made up of youth and young adults with lived experience in youth serving systems. Our Youth Best Practice Committee throughout that study participated in reviewing documents and providing recommendations on the research protocols, made recommendations when they thought things were too complicated, piloted various surveys and tools. And they really were integral throughout that process. And one reason I want to highlight this particular academic partnership is because it really did feel quite reciprocal in nature, in that they saw value in what young people were saying. They saw value in Youth Move's role throughout the study. And they also wanted to give back, so they did professional development on policy advocacy with our Youth Best Practice Committee, and were really open to having kind of back and forth with the young adult members of that committee. The other one I want to highlight is the development of the Youth Voice agency level assessment and the Youth Voice on councils. These are tools that we created in partnership with Portland State University. There are tools that measure the degree to which agencies are, involving youth in sort of agency level decision making. Again, we engaged our Youth Best Practice Committee throughout that entire process, from crafting the language, crafting questions of the survey tool, identifying what they thought the kind of themes needed to be within that tool, or sort of what are the best practices for engaging youth in agency level, governance. And we also, once we developed those tools, and there were multiple iterations with just our Youth Best Practice Committee when they were able to speak to language, but we then were able to pilot that study with a lot of youth and young adults with lived experience, in addition to kind of providers and family organization members, but quite a few young people piloted that study. And this tool in particular, or both of these tools rather, we're really proud of, because in terms of really identifying whether agencies are engaging young people in a real authentic way, we now have ways to measure that, and we have ways that we can support agencies in improving their practices towards being youth driven. And really, I like to think of the tool as kind of a quality improvement tool, right? So you can take that tool, identify your areas of growth, and work to improve that score over time. One of our more recent academic partnerships is with the University of Washington. They received some funding from the National Institute of Health to really look at the unintended consequences of various evidence-based practice implementation, implementation practices. So things like training. And I really have had so much fun on this particular study, because they engaged us from the beginning, and I think really this particular example highlights what I would consider best practice for youth participatory action research, in the sense that they engaged Youth Move National from the very beginning, including helping to write the proposal, helping to outline what the research study would look like. Our Youth Best Practice Committee, again, has been engaged during all stages of the study, from, again, development of research protocols, piloting, helping to recruit other young people to participate, and then, again, engagement of youth and young adults with lived experience outside of that committee as well, through, right now, actually, we have a survey out that we developed with this group from the Youth Best Practice Committee to really look at sort of how responsive young people perceive the mental health system to be. I also wanted to share a couple of examples of our own research that we've conducted. These are research initiatives that we've done to really help support our growth as an organization, but also to drive drive our work and drive what our priorities will be moving forward. Several years ago, we did a workforce development study, developed again in partnership with our Youth Best Practice Committee. It was really aimed at better understanding the needs of the youth and young adult workforce, especially those with lived experience, so thinking about the youth peer support workforce, youth coordinators or youth engagement specialists, to really, again, better understand what their needs are, training needs, supervision needs, pay needs, frankly. And we have used those results quite a bit to guide, the products, the tools, trainings that we've developed so that we can really be responsive to the needs of that workforce, especially since we are seeing that the youth peer workforce in particular is growing quite rapidly, and not always with the most support that it could be happening in. We also had our What Helps, What Harms initiative. This is something we've done many times, and we actually use this framework in lots of different areas of our work. It's a very simple way of conducting. It's sort of like a, focus group style. And we've had all of our chapters participate, and you really, it's just based on kind of 3 simple questions, what helps, what harms, and what's needed. So we had our chapters participate a couple of years ago. So every chapter, I think, almost participated, and they've done this process with the members of their chapters to really think about all of the different systems, education, what helps, what harms, what's needed, mental health, juvenile justice, child welfare, so that, again, it can inform our policy priorities at Youth Move National and identify where we can support not only systems, but we can support young people in creating systems change on their own. And most recently, internally, we did a research study with, in partnership with a paid, youth and young adult consultants, to really better understand the impact of COVID on youth peer support. We saw, obviously, in the spring of 2020, that almost everyone had to shift to doing work virtually for a period of time. Youth peer support is one of those things that it's not very intuitive to do virtually, maybe. So it was, again, it helped to inform how we could better support the youth peer workforce, and it guided our TA and training efforts over the past, 18 months. And it also has helped us to understand what works really well so that we can build on that, build on those practices, and then also, where is it just not, what's not working, and how can we, fill in those gaps so that we can be supportive to the youth peer workforce. And I'm gonna pause here. Okay, GoToWebinar is different. There we go. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how. Here we go. Sharing. Did it stop sharing yet? Huh, strange. Sharing. There we go. I think I did it. And with that, I think I'm handing it off to Kelly, and I'll look forward to questions that you all have, and also our discussion with Nev and Change Presenter. Where are you, Kelly?
Well, can y'all hear me? I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just gonna chat. So thanks so much, Kristen. And I'm grateful to be here with y'all today. I'm gonna introduce myself, MHA, talk about my story, how it led to the creation of our council program at MHA, and an example of some of the research that we've done. So my name is Kelly Davis. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Associate Vice President of Peer and Youth Advocacy at MHA. I work on the expansion of peer support, including formal, but also informal peer support services, and also the expansion of youth and young adult leadership. And Mental Health America, for those who aren't familiar, was founded in 1909 by a man named Clifford Beers, who was a student at Yale and in and out of the psychiatric institutions of the time. Our mental health bell, which is in our logo, is made from the melted down shackles from the state mental hospitals. So really key to our history and who we are as an organization is people's rights, people's dignity, and lived experience. And I think sometimes, because I think we want to be nice and inclusive of young people, we forget that including young people in research about themselves is a dignity question, right? Is like, do I believe that you have valuable things to say about yourself in the world? So I think just framing it from this is kind of a human dignity approach, and people really do have important things to say about, obviously, how they experience the world. So my story before coming to MHA, just a little bit of background. I grew up as somebody who from a young age felt like the way that I experienced the world was maybe different from the people around me. Had my first suicide attempt when I was 10 and really spent a lot of my early life in all sorts of mental health services, inpatient, outpatient, IOP, 5,000 psych meds, 13 diagnoses, all things. And when I was in college, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at 19 and given the message that a lot of students and people with lived experience are given, which is you have a serious mental illness, people like you don't do well in college, go home and don't stress yourself out too much. And I, had been on the verge of failing out of school, and that'll connect to the project that I talk about. But I was like, okay, I have this, what research and data tells me and clinicians tell me is my future, or I can try to find out a way to create something else for myself. And it was through that I found, I got connected to the lived experience movement. Actually, the National Empowerment Center, a blog from the National Empowerment Center is what got me connected to this whole world, and the Bazelon Center and Mental Health America. And what I found was that I got better and was able to relate to and understand myself better through connecting to these communities. Then I started advocacy on my campus, and I got out into the real full-time world job place and would tell my story, and people would clap, and then they would keep doing the same thing that they were doing and miss the whole point where my story and me doing better was in spite of what they were doing and trying to replicate. So I really found that, people, yes, want to hear young people's stories, but often critiques of research and policy and practices are dismissed as one-off when young people raise them and when activists raise them, or when they're not, or what young people are creating, if it's not tied to a formal system or service or organization, it's not taken seriously. So what I wanted to do, what I created at MHA was initially our College Mental Health Innovation Council, trying to play into people being excited by the word innovation. It's now actually our Young Mental Health Leaders Council, but the point was, like myself, a lot of people were failed by what was available to them, and they ended up having to do it themselves, right? My college told me that peer support was a liability, so I created an underground peer support program where we just did it anyway, right? Young people are doing those things, and they often aren't given legitimacy, even though they sometimes work better than the things that we're funding. So the idea behind the council is we have applications every year, and it's really kind of a, yes, we get young leaders, we connect people to leadership opportunities, but the idea is to bring together young people to connect with one another, to gather and document their ideas, and to spread their programs, because a lot of the things that when I started sharing my story and talking to other people with lived experience, found out everyone was experiencing was not taken seriously because there was no major institution or major organization saying them. So the idea was, how do we create a pathway using the way that power functions as it does, to bring in these ideas and increase perceived legitimacy, bringing together leaders and understanding, right, that people are being failed by systems, they're creating their own programs. So this research is, and understanding that research is political and ultimately tied to policy at the community level. With the council, it's really an example of how local, national, and state organizations can use something that they might already be kind of doing to sustain a different approach to research and documentation and evolution and learning as programs evolve. So I'll talk about briefly the report that we just did this past year. So the 2019-2020 Council, a real big focus from everybody was this idea of disability in higher education. So I know from my own lived experience that I mentioned, I was about to fail out of college before, having been in the system since I was 10, was 19, about to fail out of college before anybody ever said mental health was a disability to me in my whole life, right? And so many of the framing, there's very little conversation about disability accommodations in higher ed, but so much of it is, how do we get students to use more of it and not necessarily what is happening and how to make it better. A lot of the college mental health world specifically, and I think, you know, younger and older, but in college mental health specifically, mental health advocacy is typically limited to how do we get people access to services, to the exclusion often of the education part, which is why you're in school. So really through the process of working with the council, we're able to document, while connecting people to leadership opportunities, more nuanced understandings of people's experience trying to access disability accommodations or failing to access them, and create a survey where we heard from about 500 young adults who did access or identified as somebody having a psychiatric disability in higher education, right? Because one of the things that typically the way you would be doing research on psych disabilities in higher ed would be through people who are using disability services. And what we found from our audience was that 70% of the students with psych disabilities didn't have a registered for accommodations. And only 20% said it was because they didn't want them. So through this conversation of documenting these 500 people's lived experience using surveys, we combined with the conversations from our council, and we're able to really identify, document, write, and work to address all of the pieces that are missing from this area where there's just a huge shortage of research and data. So whether that's, yes, on the front end, how do we expand public education and knowledge about what is a mental health condition, what is a disability accommodation, what are different perspectives. Yes, the side of the recommendations for professors, right? We know that you should teach professors how to support and respond to students' mental health, but also some of the real questions in the middle that are not included, which is like the accommodations process itself is inaccessible, whether you're talking about disability services staff not knowing much about psych disabilities, or the idea that requiring medical documentation in a country where we know all of the equity issues that prevent people from accessing medical documentation, and having that being tied to whether or not they can get resources, right? Being able to not only unpack all of that, but document. Like a third of the survey respondents said that disability services staff did understand. So that meant 2/3 of them said that they didn't feel like their disability services staff understood psych disabilities at all. So I think that this approach, right, where we kind of blend a leadership opportunity with an opportunity for research, and then use our network and empower people on the implementation side, is a model that I think nonprofits can use to certainly partner with academics, but really do like quickly gather information and implement at the community level, using the legitimacy of an institution without also having to, a lot of my publications are gray literature. The academic publication side of things is so long, and there's so much need, and it's so fast and changing, that I think nonprofits and community organizations are a great middle function for, you know, how do we put things out quickly in ways that are adaptive and do have legitimacy, and are, you know, including people with expertise and people with lived experience at the same time. So that is my example of the program at the MHA's council, and I'll actually turn it over to Ben, who's next, who was a member of last year's council.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. That was awesome. And awesome. Share with you. Let me just pull up my slides real quick. Perfect. Is that working, everybody? That should be great. Awesome. Yeah. Hi, guys. My name is Ben Ballman. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about high school-based mental health research and some of the work that I did while I was in high school. Yeah, and just as a little overview, I'm just be giving you some background on myself, talk about the research that I conducted, and just what I do with it at the local, state level, just some takeaways from that as well. So to start, who am I? Again, my name is Ben Ballman. I am a Cornelius Vanderbilt Scholar down here in Nashville at Vanderbilt University. Like Kelly said, last year I was on Mental Health America's Youth Mental Health Leaders Council. In addition to the research that I did, I also co-founded DMV, which is DC, Maryland, Virginia area, for people who don't know that. Students for Mental Health Reform, which is a coalition of students who work to improve the resources that students had in those that little tri-state area, as well as work to develop some school-based peer support groups. And some background, all this kind of mental health journey really started for me when quite literally I was a kid. You know, back in 8th grade, that's the first time that I really remember starting to see some of the friends around me and some of my peers struggling with mental illness and their mental health. And that first kind of instance of it really began to snowball going into high school, freshman, sophomore year, when more and more of my peers really began struggling with their mental health and the implications of that, in their lives, within school, in a variety of manners. And as an extension of that, a lot of these students began coming to me for support. And so this started to kind of incite a few questions in my head. Like, why was, what's going on here? Why are so many of the people that are closest to me really struggling? And why are they coming to me, another student, as opposed to professionals that can give them proper support? So as I'm starting to ask these questions, I start to think about what are the other resources that students have. And I really start to focus on the counseling department within schools. It's kind of, if you think about it, the counseling department is there kind of as an institution within schools to give students guidance and support, and especially relating to their mental health. So that's kind of what I began to focus on. And that's what led me into the survey that I sent out. And so to kind of understand what was going on a little bit better, I sent out this Google Form survey asking students, about the counseling department and about the mental health support that they felt that they received from the counseling department. So it asked a variety of different questions relating to, emergency support, non-emergency support, and just different aspects of support on a 1 to 5 rating scale, as well as it gave a free response option. So students could go a little bit more in depth about their experiences. And so pretty much, what I did after making this is I really hunkered down for a few days and got on social media and got on different outlets and tried to spread this to as many different students as I could. And eventually I got responses from, every single student in Montgomery County, which is a county in Maryland, and is where I went to school. So I got responses from students at every single school. And I believe it was well over 400 responses in total. And some of the questions I asked, and here are a few of the answers, were asking, opinion of how well the counseling department at your school helps students in need of emergency assistance due to issues related to mental health. And if you look at the responses over here, it's fairly middle of the pack, nothing too notable on that end. But if you change the question to ask about non-emergency assistance, this one right here, you can really start to see a more negative response. And this would be relating to students who, are not necessarily in crisis, but are still struggling due to their mental health. And if you look down here again, which is one more, when I ask opinion of how well the counseling department at your school actively prevents mental issues among students, it's also more of a negative response. So, off the bat, looking at these answers, I really started to see kind of a trend relating to the active prevention of schools and their counseling departments in regards to student mental health. Moving on to the free response answers, these are all quotes from students, by the way. I started to notice kind of 3 main trends from students, and that kind of goes into counselors are apathetic to students, that students didn't really feel like counselors cared all too much about how that student was doing, that counselors mostly only cared about the academic success of students and not, the well-being of that student. And also that counselors have very difficult to access hours. In addition to that, they usually rely on students kind of reaching out and making that first point of contact, as opposed to counselors reaching out to students themselves. So from the survey, I kind of gathered 4 main takeaways, and that went into the poor outreach. Students felt that counselors virtually never reached out into the student body to practice active prevention. There was very limited availability within counselors, that students had to, struggle to fit into their counselors' schedules just to get the support that they crucially needed. That there was a strong focus on academics with counselors, and this made many students honestly, uncomfortable to change the conversation away from just academics and classes. And a general just lack of care from counselors, where, a lot of students went in and told counselors how they were feeling and felt like they were just kind of ran through a questionnaire and gotten out the door as soon as possible without any real investment on behalf of the counselor. So moving on, along with a team of other students, I kind of wanted to understand what was going on a little bit better just beyond this little preliminary survey. So with my team, I started to interview a lot of students who had gone through the counseling department, a little bit more in depth about their experiences within the counseling department, as well as talking to members of the counseling department, counselors, administrators, and school psychologists, to kind of get, both sides of the equation and just kind of get a better understanding of the issues that were going on here. And this afforded me, a better understanding and allowed me to draw some interesting conclusions for what was going on within the counseling department. And these conclusions mostly related to the structure of the counseling department on one side, as well as the lack of resources within the counseling department on the other side. So starting with the structure, I noticed that the counseling department utilizes a reactionary system wherein, counselors really waited for students to reach a critical point of crisis where either, students are actively coming to the counselor, or in a point of crisis where their deteriorated mental health is noticeable from teachers and counselors and adults. But the problem with this is usually when a student reaches this point, it's too late to give them the support that they need, at least within school and campus. In addition to that, counselors have, a myriad of other responsibilities in addition to their responsibilities towards students. They have administrative duties, academic duties, and this makes it difficult for them to balance their responsibilities to students and, do that active outreach that I was talking about earlier. In regards to the lack of resources, many counselors are responsible for between 300 and 400 individual students. And this makes it that even if a small fraction of their students are struggling with mental health, it still makes it incredibly difficult for counselors to build a relationship and to get invested in those relationships and provide the support that students need. In addition to that, many school psychologists work part-time, where they might spend Monday and Wednesdays at one school, Tuesdays, Thursdays at another school, and a Friday at the last school. And even when they're at those schools for that limited time, their responsibilities largely pertain to special education and evaluations, leaving little time for the student body as a whole. This kind of translates to a system wherein if you have a school psychologist coming to your school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but you're having a crisis on a Monday, you're completely out of luck. And so what I originally did with this research is I brought it to the local level. Along with my team, I compiled an open letter to county executives like the superintendent and the Board of Education within Montgomery County. And in this letter, I talked about some of the issues that I was seeing and invited them to meetings to kind of talk about possible resolutions to them. This letter resulted in meetings with the head of psychology and the head of counseling within Montgomery County. And this allowed me to talk a little bit about, what we were seeing on a more in-depth level and kind of work with them a little bit to try to come to some resolutions within, the structure of the counseling department specifically. And largely due to a little bit of dissatisfaction with the end result of the local level, I began to look onto the state level a little bit more. And that's when I co-founded DMV Students for Mental Health Reform. So the idea for this originally came when I was doing a lot of the interviews that I was talking about earlier. And I began to build a small kind of pseudo network of different mental health advocates within my county, within the state, and within the tri-state area. And this let me see that many schools within the DC, Maryland, Virginia area have mental health oriented clubs. Really large national organizations like You Matter and Active Minds at virtually every school. And you have these smaller school-based clubs as well, like my school had a Thrive Club, for instance. And so you have a lot of these clubs that are dedicated to mental health reform, but they only do so at the at the school level, and don't tend to look towards the local or the state level and to make a more meaningful impact. So the idea behind my coalition is to kind of bring together all these isolated pockets of mental health support to create a meaningful impact at the state level and the tri-state level as well. So along with my coalition, this past year we focused on Maryland, and specifically in the Maryland 2021 legislative window, to to garner support for House Bill 0461 and 0496. Now, House Bill 0461 advocated for mental health days in Maryland, and this would allow students to take excused absences to support their mental health. My research really supported this bill, as we saw the negative impact that a reactionary system had on student mental health, and mental health days really allowed students to, other states like Oregon, like Utah, who had implemented these, practice a more proactive system of student support, wherein a school is seeing which students are taking mental health days, which students are taking what number of mental health days, and are allowed to check in with these students and see if they need more support. In addition to that, it's just a cost-free measure to allow students just another avenue to support themselves. If we look at House Bill 0496, on the other hand, it just exponentially increases the budget for mental health resources within schools. And this will allow schools to hire more counselors and school psychologists, and really kind of combat the negative effects of a lack of resources that I talked about earlier that has been kind of a detriment to student mental health. So to wrap up, all this really started from a question that I was asking. I haven't conducted research in the formal sense that you would normally think of, with funding or guidance or a control setting or independent and dependent variables, but I was still able to ask a question and get a lot of meaningful data back and give that and communicate that meaningful data to those empowered to try and make a change. So I guess if there's any moral of this story, at least from the student perspective, is, if you see a problem, sometimes it's as easy as just asking a question and seeing where it takes you. Thank you. I think I'm passing it off to Shannon now.
Hi, y'all. All right, I'm going with my share screen. Can you see this presentation? Is this working? Okay, perfect. So thanks everybody for being here. Quick introduction on me, just to start, and then I'll kind of move into a bit more about this project and kind of how it came about, and then kind of where I'm hoping to go with it. So my name's Shannon Pagden. I use she and they pronouns. I currently work as a program coordinator for the Mental Health Association of San Francisco. And I also work part-time as a research assistant for the New York State Psychiatric Institute. I am really passionate about kind of shifting current systems of mental health as somebody who has been a part of those systems for a really long time. And as this slide says, specifically into smaller communities and changing language to be more open-ended, which are both things that I really struggled with in the past, just with language being closed, not describing my experiences, and also being in a small town, not having access to resources was very challenging. And of course, today I'm here to discuss a bit about my project on the intersections of trauma and psychosis. So just to kind of get going with a little bit of background, this project is really important to me because I have lived with psychosis since I was 17 years old, and I found a lot of my personal experience has kind of resulted in trauma. I found the experience was really devalued by my care team when I mentioned it in the past, and it gave me a really deep sense of powerlessness as a young adult. I specifically remember like Googling trauma and psychosis after I had kind of brought it up to my care team, and just not really being able to find information on it. And yet, when I started to work as a peer a few years ago, I found it came up a lot. Like people would mention it specifically, and it would kind of come up in different conversations. And so this project is really just kind of my passion on a number of different levels, and it kind of allows us to give a voice to experiences that haven't really been given enough importance in my life and also in the life of others that I know. And as far as like a larger community goes, psychosis in general is underrepresented within mental health, and especially kind of as having a relationship with trauma. And we have, kind of tried to better understand the relationship between prior trauma as well as how those experiences can in and of themselves like lead and contribute to trauma. So as this kind of says, the aim was to conduct a study that seeks to better understand the relationships between prior experiences of trauma or adversity and experiences such as hearing voices, unusual beliefs, and paranoia, as well as the ways in these experiences themselves can contribute to trauma or distress. And kind of offshooting of that, we want to help spark conversations around psychosis and bring visibility to how it can have many different impacts in people's life. And it's also been important to let participants use their own descriptions of their experiences, since so much clinical language doesn't necessarily encompass what folks resonate with. I know when I kind of myself started to seek alternative language to my experience, I was like, yes, this is exactly it. And the language I've been given really doesn't necessarily describe my experience. So just to kind of reiterate some of the importance, it helps shed light on more historically neglected experiences of psychosis. It kind of contributes to help shifting the language around mental health. And also, as I just said, allows folks to kind of use their own words to describe these experiences, and gives a name to experiences that are often under-acknowledged. So we created a survey with a range of questions about kind of different experiences. We used multiple choice questions as well as open-ended questions. And we got a little over 200 responses from all over the world, and kind of are now working on moving into next steps. So we're hoping to move into individual interviews in the future, and then work on publishing the findings to a larger audience. And I also want to continue to kind of work within this subject. I feel, of course, very personally passionate about it, and I feel like it's very lacking in a research sense. And I would really hope to kind of shift that in the future. And I also find projects like this to be very healing and empowering for myself. As you know, I mentioned, the system kind of didn't necessarily give me all of these things as I've been within it. And so just to be able to create that change myself and get really a reward from hearing how much other folks have resonated with these things is really incredible. And of course, I really I love this project. It's been amazing to bring so many of my passions to kind of an intersection. Yeah, I really appreciate everybody's time and attention. I had just a short little presentation prepared here, and I am going to pass it off to
You're actually the last one, Shannon.
Aha.
And so now we can now go into Q&A. Wait. Q&A, and then I do have questions for you guys to get conversation going, but we'll turn to the audience first. So if you do have a question, members of the audience, please just type those in under the questions section, and then we'll be able to respond. The first one, so just a question about the link to the youth research interest survey that's down in the chat. You should be able to just click on the hyperlink, and I know a couple of people I think have already successfully filled it out. Latricia asked, so I'll just read the question. I would really like to know more about research on better pay for our peers. This is something I believe is such a disparity within behavioral health. So sort of a research related to pay and compensation. And just want to see if anybody has a specific response or anything they want to say about this issue.
I mean, I don't. Oh, go ahead, Ned.
No, go for it, Kristen.
I was going to speak to during our workforce survey, we did ask questions about pay, and we did see that there was a range, but you know, frankly, for the most part, it was very clear that youth peer providers are not paid a living wage, and that even if they are paid a living wage, they don't necessarily have access to other benefits, or have access to, like, so maybe they make an okay wage, but they are only given, part-time work. So really, it was very clear that that you're right. Like the pay, there is a huge pay disparity between youth peers compared to even compared to some other non-traditional supports, like community health workers or something. And I think there's probably lots of reasons for that. One, I think there's still work to be done to, for lack of a better term, convince providers and others that there's value in hiring young adults with lived experience, that there's value in youth peer support. One of the things we also know is that youth peer support itself doesn't have a ton of research behind it. I mean, there's some from the adult peer movement, but even that's quite limited. And so I think it would be very valuable for more research to be done on youth peer support's effectiveness, because then I think you can translate that to advocacy for higher pay, for access to more, career development, professional development, and really just an investment in the youth peer workforce. But unfortunately, there's, from my knowledge, not a ton of research around youth peer support that's out there.
I mean, I can add, so some of my work has kind of frontally tackled this topic in conjunction with national peer organizations, so collaborative projects that have looked at, really kind of focused on working conditions, not just pay, but also perceived influence and respect, experiencing kind of discrimination, so sort of support for lived experience in the workplace, climate and culture, that sort of thing. And, including pay is, in terms of trying to understand concerns across a huge national sample that included, so sort of everyone. It's not youth specific, although there is a subsection of the sample that's people, some of them youths themselves, working in a variety of settings, sometimes young adult focused programs, although not necessarily aged matched peers. So it just sort of runs the gamut, right? Across the board, pay is, of course, just a huge concern, and positions structured in a way that provide no benefits. Documenting that is one thing. And I mean, I think actually there's sort of just widespread understanding, even among kind of administrators and policymakers, that pay is really inadequate. How to sort of leverage that research to push for change, I think, is a really good question. So one thing that I've done in presentations, and I don't mean academic presentations, but at peer conferences, to policymakers, stakeholders, provider conferences, practice conferences, right, is like, really kind of building out slides that juxtapose what a living wage would be in a particular place. And of course, that varies hugely, whether you're talking about rural Tennessee, New York City, Boston, to, kind of using that data to say that average pay for peer specialists based on our survey in that city or region, right? And just the huge disparity, and sometimes just kind of breaking down what is average rent in this area. So it's not just kind of a number about living wage, but what's average rent. So we're really trying to hammer home this message of, we are kind of putting people into these roles with very limited career mobility and with really kind of problematic working conditions. So I mean, I think here I'm kind of just trying to get at, how does one use research to try to highlight things in a different way, to try to help make the case. And sometimes that's, you should do it because it's the right thing. Sometimes there's an element of kind of moral shaming, like, this is unethical, this is actually social injustice. And I'll just say kind of one other thing, point that I make there, is that if the whole goal of a lot of community mental health and psychiatric rehabilitation services is to, kind of ensure that people are kind of valued, integrated members of the community. What exactly are we doing when in the mental health system, the positions we ourselves have created are structured in a way that provides a non-living wage? And like, how can we claim to be the workforce that is helping to quote unquote rehabilitate people or help with their recoveries when we're not making good on our own kind of promises? So it's sort of like, you know, one thing is that research can get us some knowledge, but then I think it's sort of how do we use that? How do we frame it in a way that's gonna maybe, you know, kind of move us on the path to change in some fashion?
Yeah, I think that speaks to the importance, right? The one thing is like a lot of research stays in the realm and world of research, and people who do research talk about the research, and then the people who would be impacted never learn about it. The people who make decisions never learn about it. So I think that this gets at the point of kind of what we're talking about, of having research be a more active, like collaborative process, but also with the results. Because, right, you could have somebody who works in policy who's thinking about, all right, we have all of this money coming in through mental health education and mental health block grants for young people, and like, oh, like somebody who's talking about an activist. When I talk to people about peer support wages, a lot of times they talk about unionizing, right? Community organizations who are working directly with people. All of these different groups have a different perspective and something valuable to say. Some of them can say things that others can't say politically too. So I think that it's really important to have to think about and frame research as part of social movements, right? Which is kind of what we're saying is like everybody has a voice and a role, and we want to make sure that in the communities, whether that's the national, state, or local level, that we are communicating across those different groups in a way that often doesn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple questions in the queue for Ben, somebody who wants to get in touch with you. We'll give you that information, and then just a question of whether either of the Maryland bills actually passed.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. So we were able to get an amendment to House Bill 0461, which is the mental health aid bill, but it wasn't brought to vote in the Senate. Sadly, it was passed in the House. And the second bill, House Bill 0496, was also just not brought to vote as well while it was in the Senate. So sadly, neither went through. That was kind of what I was saying earlier about, although, you know, maybe like tangible changes haven't been necessarily made, or I mean, there were a few at the local level. I think the meaning from my research really just comes from asking like these questions that people aren't necessarily asking, and getting, you know, really meaningful and interesting answers to them, and bringing those answers to those in power who can make a change. So I feel like the process of advocacy isn't kind of like this whole journey really only took me about 2 years, from when I was really starting to do the research in sophomore year to my senior year when I was bringing it to the 2021 Maryland State Legislature. That's a really short time span. I think advocacy takes a lot more time, and that's something I really had to realize. But I think I really do get a lot of meaning from the fact that I'm bringing these answers to the attention of legislators.
I have a question for Shannon and Ben. So I think one of the things that like everyone has gotten at, right, is like the absence of research on youth peer support, or viewing lived experience perspectives, or some of the things that like anybody who tries to get help for a month will realize that's like not documented or funded by people who have power, right? And then the evidence and what you can get funded builds off of the wrong assumptions that right? So it's this like endless cycle. Where was there pushback? What was it like, and how did you deal with it? Like, was your approach to research, or your like perspectives from your lived experience, were they like delegitimized, or did folks mostly take your research and what you were saying seriously, and how did you navigate that process?
I can go first. It was definitely a bit of a process just because of how kind of informal my research was. You know, I used a free application like Google Forms to just kind of get specific opinions. The pool was a fair bit over 400, which is still relatively small in context to, you know, how many students are in Montgomery County at large. But I think the fact that I had, you know, like interviews with a lot of different students from both sides of the spectrum, you know, the students as well as also, you know, members of the counseling department gave me a lot more credibility as I was kind of getting it from both ends. And I tried not to rely so heavily on just the Google form research because, I mean, there's a lot of ways you can kind of dispute that, like what you were talking about. And a lot of people try to at the local level and at the state level. I think less so at the state level, though, for whatever reason. Interesting. But I think I was really able to lean onto the interviews, onto the lived experiences of a lot of students who had gone to me and told me a little bit about, you know, what they gone through and their kind of experiences with the counseling department. That really helped me. So I guess to answer your question partially, but I think leaning a lot more heavily onto the lived experience and those anecdotes helped me a lot more.
Yeah, from my end, I'm really lucky in that my mentor on this project is somebody with lived experience. So I don't think that was actually great, because it's really like it was a more empowering experience. But I've definitely found a lot of pushback, actually specifically with language, when I've tried to kind of incorporate more open-ended language into work. I have noticed that there is a tremendous amount of pushback with that, and it's been a really important experience to kind of learn how to advocate, and that my experience is of value, because I think that that's something I've actually struggled with coming to terms with myself in the past. So it's like, no, you know, I this is why I'm here, you know, and just to kind of be able to create that space and you know, not allow those things to impact me as much as they have in the past has been really, really important. But I hope that answers your question.
Good. Shannon, you might though talk about the visions, even though it wasn't technically a research project, how this, you know, how one would sort of think it would be uncontroversial and welcomed, and yet that's not what we have found. I can post a link to it just so people can see what you're talking about in the chat, but I think, you know, there's some kind of clear resistance. It would be interesting to hear you weigh in on.
Do you mean Beyond the Box?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's another project that I've worked on with Nev that's just it's called Beyond the Box. It's a living document, if anybody feels so inclined to contribute, but it's essentially a compilation of folks being able to describe their experiences in their own words. And as I've mentioned, it's like with psychosis, I know that we've definitely found that the terminology that we're given does not always describe the experience as well at all. It's very limiting. And so just kind of allowing for folks to use their own words to frame things and be more open-ended without judgment. But there has definitely been, again, as with language, there's been a lot of the value of it can be seen in very different ways. And I think that clinicians, in my experience, can be a little bit less willing to see, like not everybody frames their experience in as positive a way as others. And so just kind of that rawness, I think, inherently can create a lot of pushback from folks. And yes, that has been a challenge, is just kind of having to create that value in that space. It is, yeah, it's an ongoing process, I would say.
So thanks, Shannon. Yeah, and I'll add too, because Shannon and I worked on this project together. It was really Shannon's brainchild, but just some of how embracing the kind of the user survivor experience or community has been, and then how specific areas of concern because we asked people about like what their personal strategies are for kind of dealing with distressing things, and when it's not medications or medications made things worse, or, and, you know, any one of these controversial areas that we all, I mean, you know, predictably enough, right? It's like, oh, and then there's this like fear that if you have somebody, even though there's 10 people saying antipsychotics really helped, you have a few others saying they didn't help at all, they made things worse, this fear that that kind of plays into non-adherence or something, even if people aren't using that language. So yeah, just even the open kind of, you know, just learning from other people with the same experience, there being this sort of fear almost about that. This leads into a question that I was gonna ask all of you, which is, so it's sort of related, and so Ben and Shannon, you might have kind of answered this in part, but sort of for all of you to just kind of comment on places where you've run into more genuine kind of support for youth or user survivor disability leadership, and, you know, kind of places where you have felt maybe more tokenized or feel like it's more kind of problematic.
I mean, I'll sort of, oh, sorry, Kelly. Speak to the first part in particular, and that is that the academic partnerships, for the most part, that we have had have been really positive experiences, but I think that's in part because we vet who asks us to join them in research, and we also like look out for red flags. Like if you're bringing us in after pretty much everything is done, that's not an authentic partnership. And so we really have kind of created criteria for our organization before we say, yes, we'll do something with you, to really look to see, like, is this someone who's going to work with us in an authentic way? You know, are they bringing us in at the beginning of the project, or are they bringing us in, you know, after they've done data analysis and want us to help craft recommendations or something, right? You know, so really looking for those types of indicators that it's going to be a mutually beneficial partnership. And so that my experience, you know, in those contexts has been really great. Now, I have had other experiences in non-academic settings where, you know, there's been requirements maybe from the funder to have youth voice at the table, and so they'll subcontract with us, and it hasn't been a particularly great experience in that, you know, we aren't seen completely as valuable, or that we aren't invited into the space to really, you know, craft from the beginning. And that's, you know, it's like always apparent when you're in it, right? Like it's just like a really icky feeling. That's not a very sophisticated way of describing it, but, you know, being talked over or having your perspectives kind of like, oh yeah, that's nice, and then like, you know, deferring to someone else and not really seeing that lived experience component as valuable expertise, or seeing it as a liability, right? You know, we worked with one organization and they worked with health plans, and I had to like justify over and over and over again, and even refer to research that says, actually, like patient engagement, if that's the language you want to use, has been shown to be quite successful, and it has shown to improve outcomes and decrease, you know, but it was like this constant struggle of having to justify and prove that there was value, like, you know, value in having us at the table and inviting other young people into this space.
Yeah, I would just add that in a lot of ways, it feels like there's just enough public discourse and interest to make young people interesting, to say, how do we make more young people use this? But like not openness when the answer is it's not good. Or that, you know, like there's reasons why that you should unpack. Kind of to your point, Shannon, right, is like, well, if there's a fundamental flaw, It's same with the peer, like the field of peer support, right? It's like, oh, peers help people engage with services, but you have to be willing to also change the services in the short and long term, if that makes sense.
Shannon, Ben, I know you kind of, you know, in a way got at this already, but anything you might want to add there around points of resistance where it's felt kind of harder to work versus where you felt really kind of empowered as leaders?
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of touched on this a little bit in the presentation as well. But I really think that when I came to those meetings after I sent that open letter to the superintendent and the Board of Education, I was kind of relegated to just meeting with the head of counseling and head of psychology. And in those meetings, I just kind of felt like, they were hearing what I was saying, but they weren't properly listening. They just kind of had me in, they heard me out and had me out the door. And they didn't really hear any of the issues that I was raising or any of the possible resolutions that I was trying to work with them about. And kind of just had me in to probably say that they, had a student in and listened to a student. That was definitely frustrating and really kind of decentralizing as a student because, I was doing all this work kind of by myself. I didn't have, any funding, any like organized support. It was just kind of me on my own volition. And like as a student and even as an advocate, to kind of hit a dead end like that, it's really kind of demoralizing. But kind of looking beyond that at the state level, when I was reaching out to delegates and legislators, I really appreciate, I did have to work a fair bit to kind of get their attention, and a lot of time I had to speak to an aide, but I really felt like I was having, frank conversations with them, as opposed to the local level when they were just kind of nodding their heads and agreeing with me, but not really doing anything about it. When I was talking to legislators or their aides, they were raising, proper concerns, and I was able to have a good back and forth with them to kind of understand their understanding and get my point across a lot better. So I guess to summarize, the local level, it wasn't so effective, but I think I was able to, really be heard at the state level, and I really appreciated that.
I think.
Oh, yeah, go for it, Shannon.
I was just gonna say, I think the big one for me has just been being dismissed, and not even necessarily in the sense of not being heard, which is something I always find very interesting. Sometimes people actually do want to hear my ideas, and then there's just nowhere to go for them. Like when I actually am honest and I'm like, okay, this is how things could be improved. There's just no direction and there's no actual path forward, and so that is incredibly frustrating to me. It's like not just necessarily to the ideas can be heard, and there's just no way to actually implement them or to change those systems in an easy way. So I struggle with that, and just kind of I actually do find research to be very empowering. I love peer work, and yet since I've been moving more in a direction of like research in my life and in my work, I find it to be more of that like systems level change that I really find empowering as a person. It's just so it's become a part of my recovery in a weird way, because I just find it to be much more like it feels like there's more longevity to it to me, and I really love that. It's so I do find it to be a very empowering thing just in general to conduct research.
Awesome, thank you guys. Those are all a lot of great points and distinctions, and I think kind of an ongoing challenge again to sort of how to really be taken seriously, how to also have sort of enough power, I guess, that if you do reach kind of an impasse, I don't know, that I guess that you yourself could then do that thing or make that change. Elliot then, so we do have another question from the audience. Elliot asks what each of you have planned next for your advocacy focuses or advocacy and research focuses or your next projects. And Ben, you smile, so I'll therefore go to
I can probably go first because I feel like my answer is the most ambiguous because I have no idea. I really do focus on, mental health advocacy, all throughout high school and, in the summer leading up to college, I've done a lot of work with Mental Health America. And, I worked for a mental health philanthropy company over the summer. Well, right now I'm just kind of in my freshman year of college and I don't want to kind of isolate myself into just one thing or the other. So I'm really just kind of being open with where I kind of take my interests and see where that leads me. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Awesome.
I have a very non-specific answer and a very specific answer. So I'll go somewhere in the middle. I, if you can't tell, love language around mental health, and I really want to move into that. And I've had like a million different ideas in the last year about where I specifically want to take that direction, but I do think that that I really, really want to focus on that in the next few years is just my personal intersection of language and mental health. And there just seem to be a lot of inconsistencies, quite frankly. It's like, and I'm curious to kind of look at differences between clinicians, between family members, between people with lived experience, and just kind of, if there is crossover, what that crossover is and how it's received by folks. And I have no idea how I would do that, what that would look like, anything like that, but I definitely want to look more into language. It is just truly, I'm so passionate about it. As you can tell, I just find it to be very interesting. So.
From Youth Move National's perspective, I think I can say it's always youth peer support is on our radar, both in terms of, some of the discussions we were having earlier about, what the work environment is like, making sure that there's adequate supports, supervision, living wages, all the things, right? As well as, really capturing the effectiveness of youth peer support, because as I mentioned very briefly earlier, in some cases, particularly with, clinicians or psychiatrists, it's still sort of seen as like a pseudo science type thing, right? It's not necessarily always seen as like a valid support. And we know that intuitively, but also anecdotally, and just from talking to young people, that it is really a valuable service. So I think, youth peer support will continue to be our main area of focus. And then also just, depends on who comes knocking on the door.
I would say, touching on, I guess, two of the things that I mentioned earlier. One is more research on universal accessibility practices. So if the accommodations process is not good and can't be fixed or can't be fixed completely, what do bigger policy and practice changes look like so that students we don't have to build campuses that rely on medical documentation and your professors being nice. And then the other piece is, we have all of these examples of young people developed mental health programs. How can we support them in measuring and publishing on those programs?
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And then we have another audience question for each of you, and this is probably going to be so maybe like 1 minute each of you because we end at 6. But what is your best advice about starting the process of uplifting and supporting youth voice? Nice way to end it.
So I can start as well. I think the number one thing that I've noticed is just kind of a lack of education among youth. This whole process was really a struggle for me because beyond AP, NSL, government, which is a class I took in high school, I have no understanding of the systems of government. Even that class, which is an entirely outdated class, only focused on the national level and kind of America in an ideal sense. But never really talked about, what I can do as an individual to create change in my local governments and my state government. So I think a really important step that not a lot of people are focusing on right now is just kind of empowering students and telling them about the power that they have as an individual to make change, and educating them on the systems of government and what they can do, and maybe the proper etiquette of reaching out to a legislator, or kind of the fundamentals of coalition building and bringing groups together to make a change, and just really important topics like that that students nowadays have no idea about.
I have a thought as well. Just I would say the big thing for me is just openness, like creating space for those conversations and actually hearing them is really important. And of course, education, I agree as well. Just kind of more access to those resources. I know I definitely didn't know a ton about mental health until I actually started experiencing challenges as a kid. And so just kind of having those conversations early on and holding space. And another one for me would be like reporting back, especially with research, because I've found that as I've participated in research in the past, I never hear back. I have no idea what happened. I don't know. And it's really disheartening because you're like, okay, but did this make an impact? What happened? And so especially from a lived experience perspective, like just for me, it's very important to actually tell people what happened and how these things have kind of been, what's just the impact of it. I think that would actually spark more interest in research from a youth perspective. So that's my answer.
Recording in progress.
I'm gonna piggyback on both of what you both just said, because that was the first thought that came to mind for me, was that we need to invest in young people, and then that training needs to actually happen in a bi-directional way. Like we need to invest in helping young people, training them to be to be able to authentically participate, whether it's in research or joining a advisory council, right? Like if we just throw them in without any support, like you're setting them up for failure. And then also training your colleagues, your peers on the value of having young people at the table, why it's important, to have them. And then finally, like measuring youth voice. So, speaking to the two tools that we created,
Recording stopped.
Getting a sense of where you're at so that you can start to build and improve your practices of engaging young people.
Yeah, I would say make yourself more fun and take them more seriously, because a lot of our work meetings are not fun or engaging for adults also, but especially for young people. And then I would say if you can think about and remember how little control and how not serious people took you when you were a teenager and a young adult, and like think about that and just how powerful, right? The one the one supportive adult, just like how powerful it is when your whole life is controlled by other people, to have somebody actually take you seriously and say, I'm not just going to listen to you, I'm going to work with you.
Well, thank you guys. That's really great parting advice. I'm sure, anybody here would be happy to field questions or connect with anyone directly who's interested in doing so. And then again, we will kind of get back to anybody who filled out the youth research survey link and wanted to find out more. And other than that, thank you all in the audience for attending, and we definitely hope to hear from some of you. Okay, so.